Hey everyone, and welcome to our September live event for National Quilter Circle. Once again, we are joined with Susan Guzman, who is back to answer all of your quilting questions. So thank you for being here, Susan.
Oh, you're welcome. It's so great to be back.
Of course. And so I want to just remind everybody that you can ask questions. I know the page probably looks a little bit different this time than it did last time. So we have a chat box this time instead of having to submit a question in. So if you have any questions, you can just type those right into the chat box, and then we'll work our way through answering those over the next hour. So we see that a lot of people are already tuning in from all over the world, really. So we're glad to have you.
Well, that's exciting.
Yeah. So our first question here comes from Carol, and she says, how do you go about picking fabrics for a quilt? How do I know if prints go with prints or if I should just stick with solids?
Well, really, I think that that's a personal preference. If you like, kind of think through what your goal is. With using solids, that's typically a more contemporary look. If you like something that's maybe a little bit more warm, or you want a little more interest, then I would incorporate prints. Of course, always you can combine the two, solids and prints. So really, I think it's a personal preference. Ashley, do you use a lot of solids? I know I do not. I use a lot of prints.
I do. I think we're exact opposites on this. And if anybody like followed us during the last challenge, know that like you like prints and I made mine 100% out of solids. And I do that because I think I am on the side where I'm afraid that they're not going to look good together. So I just sort of stay away from them in general. I'm trying to branch out though and add more prints in. But so I guess a follow-up to that would be, what if you put it together and you don't like how it looks? Can it be saved with quilting, or should you just try to rip it out and start over?
What you mean, the look to be saved with quilting?
Yeah.
Well, I guess so. I quite frankly, I think whatever you end up making, I've really never heard anybody who's been disappointed, because you know the beauty of quilting is as you go, you can kind of lay out your blocks and kind of plan. So if there's something that you don't like, you can go ahead and pull that out. To go back to the first part of the question, as far as choosing fabrics are concerned, what I would recommend that you do is that if, let's say that there's one fabric that you're really attracted to. I just heard this recently from another designer where he, when he started quilting, he looked along the selvage edge and he looked at all the colors that were there, and he started pulling fabrics that blended with those colors. And that's a really great way for you to like pull in different types of fabrics that will, at least color-wise, will blend together. And going back to my interior design days, what we did is we would choose like a large print, and that would typically go like on a sofa. And then we would pick some coordinating, say like a geometric print, and that could go on a side chair. And I realized that this is we're not talking interior design today, but a lot of those tips that I learned from doing interior design, I've pulled into quilting. And so if you start with like that main print that you might love, start pulling in different prints such as you know, your geometrics, or a mini print, a mini floral, and just kind of change it up that way.
Absolutely. And say another thing that I've just started doing is finding a collection of fabrics, and not necessarily using the whole collection, because sometimes that can be just way too much, but pick your favorite 2 or 3 prints from the collection and then add in, like you said, using those little color circles at the bottom of the fabric, those colors that match with it.
Yeah, definitely.
Perfect.
Yeah, and a lot of the fabric companies today are putting collections out on their websites, and you can see their complete collection. So that can kind of help you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, our next question here, this is from Megan, and she wants to know if you piece with a different weight of thread than you quilt with.
Piece with a different, no, I personally, I do not, I don't quilt, I don't do the act of quilting a whole lot. I usually use what I have on hand, but quite frankly, you probably should, like I use 50 weight cotton to piece with, because I just love how it kind of disappears into the fabrics. and it is still very sturdy. I happen to use Aurifil. I do represent the company, but I've found that it's just a very high quality thread. There are very many high quality threads out there. That's one particular one that I've gravitated towards and that I really love. So, but anyway, I use a 50 weight. I would actually recommend that you use 40, at least a 40 weight, so just a little bit thicker. Use a 40 weight thread for doing the act of quilting your layers together.
Gotcha. And if somebody is confused about the different weights of thread, I have ones here. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it or if it says it on here, but on your thread spool, on one of the sides, it will generally tell you, this one does not, so this is a bad example, but it will generally tell you what weight it is, 40, 50, or 60, or other, and then you can pick from that. So the heavier weight thread, obviously, it's going to show up a little bit more than, like you mentioned, the other thread sort of disappears into the quilting. Yeah. Since you are with Aurifil, didn't they just, I feel like I saw this on Instagram today, that they did the ginormous quilt spool? Did you see that?
I did not see it.
Okay, it's like,
it wasn't on social media very much today.
Okay, I think it's like, I might get the numbers wrong, but it's either, I think it's 20 feet tall. The biggest spool of thread has been unveiled in Quilt Town, USA, and it's got like millions of yards of thread wrapped around. It's pretty cool. So I'll find that and I'll share that on the page because it is pretty cool.
Oh, cool.
All right, next question here. Donna says, what is the best way to square fabric before cutting it? And she says, thanks, from Newfoundland, Canada.
To square up fabric before you cut it.
Yes.
The best way to do it, I feel, and I'm speaking of yardage, you know, it's funny because we have so many different pre-cuts that are available. And so, you know, one might think that way. So let's talk yardage. How I do it is I keep it folded. I press my fabric and I just literally just press it on the ironing board. A good section, probably not quite a yard, but usually about 3/4 of a yard or so, I press, and then I bring it over to my cutting mat, and I do use the large cutting mats, the 36 by 24. And then the ruler I like to use to square up the edge, and that's what I'm assuming the square up means, is the edge. I use a 6 by 24 inch ruler. Excuse me. And what I do is I line that up. I do things, I think, a little bit differently than a lot of people do. I am self-taught, so I may have some what would be considered maybe bad habits to other people, but how I do it is I line that yardage up on one of the lines of my cutting mat, and I also line up the edges along the bottom, so the selvage edges that you need at the bottom. I line that up again along the bottom line of my cutting mat, and that's how I get my straight, my first straight cut, and then I go from there. Keep in mind that your fabrics do tend to shift a little bit, so you need to be careful. But every now and then, let's say you're cutting like 10 strips that are 2.5 by width of fabric. Every maybe 3-4 strips that you cut, you want to just like reestablish that you're still cutting a real straight line because of that shifting that does occur. It's just something that naturally occurs.
Absolutely. And because, of course, we know I have to mention this all the time, we have a video on National Quilter Circle. If you want a visual on everything that she just explained, we actually have an instructor, Heather, who did do a video on that. So, and I think it's even called like how to square up your fabric for cutting. So we can search that and watch that video as well. Our next question here, this is from Vicky, and she says that she has great tools and machines. She tries to cut and sew accurately, yet my blocks just don't line up right, or points of a pinwheel are off. I know that's a huge question, but do you have any suggestions for better accuracy?
If you're doing some, let's just take the pinwheel block, for instance. One great thing to do is whatever your cut size is of your original. So pinwheel consists of, let's see, 4 half square triangle patches. And what I suggest you do until you can kind of master that is cut those squares, the fabric squares that you meet up, the first two that you meet up that you're sewing together that are going to become two half square triangle units, make those, bump those up, what is it, an eighth of an inch. So instead of, typically they say cut your square, let's say it's going to be a finished 2-inch half square triangle unit. You want to bump that for your fabric unit from 2 7/8 inches up to 3 inches. And then make your half square triangle units, and then go ahead and trim those down because they'll be a little bit oversized from just a little over 2.5 inches, those half square triangle units. So you want to trim those down to 2.5 inches because that's what your goal is. And then go ahead and piece your pinwheel block, sorry, pinwheel block together. And when you go to pin that all together and sew that all together, what I recommend is you use a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So what that means is a thread or two less than a 1/4 inch. Sew those together and you'll probably be spot on. Another key tip is to take it slow. Take it really slow. And I know myself, I'm an impatient person, but in the beginning, I made myself go slow, and now I pretty much nail it all the time. So just give yourself, a little bit of time and be patient, and you'll end up nailing those. I know they can be really frustrating to make sometimes.
This is what I was reaching over to get this. So this is a little pinwheel, part of a pinwheel. I'm folding the rest of the block back because you can't see it yet, and it'll be answered why in one of these questions coming up. But so this is a pinwheel, if you are unfamiliar with what she was explaining how to do. And I believe I don't know if it's on the site yet, but I just did a video that will be on the site soon for how to make a pinwheel and then turn that into some disappearing pinwheel blocks as well. So tons of pinwheel options on the site.
Exciting.
Yeah. Okay. The next one here, Deanna says, any tips for better paper piecing? I just started a paper piecing quilt, but I'm not really enjoying it. I have a pattern that really needs to be paper pieced.
Gosh, I sure wish we had like a couple of hours just to play when we're doing these chats, these live chats, because that's something that you definitely do have to. I would recommend watching a video, and I'm sure there's probably some through National Quilter Circle, Ashley.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I would watch a video on it because there's something about doing the foundation paper piecing and watching how it's properly done is so much easier than trying to figure it out yourself. I could sit and explain it, but I don't have any props right now, so I probably confuse the whole audience. So I would strongly recommend that you look for a video. I know that there's tons on YouTube, but if you are a member of National Quilter Circle, I would recommend going out and searching for one of those videos.
Absolutely. And speaking of paper piecing, so Deanna, if you didn't catch, last month I actually got to be at National Quilter Circle's headquarters in Minnesota, and we did a little live video, and I was actually demonstrating a paper piecing block of all things. And so it was a block that's actually part of a paper piecing bundle that's available in the shop right now on National Quilter Circle. And I have a promo code. It's Ashley60. And if you put that in, you get 60% off this paper piecing pattern bundle, which is so hard to say. So if you find that you want to try out some paper piecing and don't have patterns, there's some good ones to check out. But then as far as videos, so we have that live video that was last month that is in the blog section of National Quilter Circle. We have a bunch of free videos, premium videos, and a complete class taught by Laura Roberts on foundation paper piecing as well. So there are so many resources on our site for paper piecing. All right, our next one here, Kathy says, does the quilting thread and piecing thread need to be of different strengths? So that's kind of what we were talking about before.
Yeah, I would recommend that whatever piecing thread that you use, if it's 40 weight or above, so 40, 30 weight, I wouldn't go any thicker than 30 weight. to do your piecing with, only because your thread starts getting thicker. As the number gets lower, your thread is getting thicker. So I piece with 50 weight, and I just love how it kind of sinks into the fabric and it just disappears. So it's really nice, and it just gives you really beautiful blocks. But I would recommend that you use at least 40 weight for your quilting, because it's a little bit thicker, and it's stronger, and it will hold everything together a lot better.
Perfect. All right, this one is sort of along the same lines as when we were talking about our pinwheel, but Cheryl says, even if I cut my fabric correctly and my seams are accurate, when I sew my flying geese together, I still lose my points. How do I correct this?
I would recommend that you use a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. I was having problems with that myself when I first started quilting, and now every time that's what I do. And when you think about it, a scant 1/4 inch seam, so your 2 threads, about 1 to 2 threads of your fabric less than a 1/4 inch. When you piece those together, think about when that opens up, those extra threads that you're not sewing. So those 2 that I'm saying, scant, those are going to be like right where those 2 meet, those 2 pieces meet that you're sewing together. And so when you open that up, that's why you're able to get that sort of spot on point. But just practice it, and you'll nail it.
Yeah. I see Vicky asked about how you do a scant 1/4 inch. So I hope that answers your question, Vicky, on how to do the scant 1/4 inch. I have this little sample here. It's just working out for everything. So this top little piece is the flying geese. And so when she's talking about losing a point, I believe it's this point that she's talking about. So like when I like to do it, I guess I've never tried the scant 1/4 inch one. I'm going to have to do that and see if that works. But I like to, when I'm pinning my pieces together, I don't know if you can see my thread because it's kind of blends in a little bit, but I'll take and actually put a straight pin right through that point on the bottom of the flying geese right here, and then put that exactly a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the one I'm sewing it to. And then I know that right where my pin's at, I need to stitch, and like my needle needs to go right where the pin is, and then I can pull the pin out. And then you should be able to see, again, I use my thread that's all matching my fabric, but that it goes right through that intersection point of the seam too. So that should also help, hopefully.
Definitely.
Perfect. All right. Nina asked, is pre-washing your fabrics still recommended for today's quilting fabrics? And if so, what about pre-cuts, which are not washed, mixed with regular fabrics that have already been washed?
I would recommend that if you're, I'll answer the first part first.
Mm-hmm.
Your pre-cut fabrics, those are difficult to pre-wash. I do not pre-wash any of my fabrics. And for the most part, I would say probably 99% of the time I'm using quilt shop quality fabrics. So any of the fabrics that, let's say that you have yardage and you're mixing that in with the pre-cuts like you said, I just wouldn't pre-wash it. That would be my recommendation. As far as it bleeding, I have never had a problem with quilt shop quality fabrics, and I specify that because let's say like Joanne Fabrics does have some fabrics that are a little bit less, they're not as hefty as quilt shop quality fabrics are, and they are made in different manufacturing plants around the world. And since you're unfamiliar with whatever that manufacturer is, which most of us would be, I would recommend pre-washing those fabrics. So.
Absolutely. I am on the same opinion with you. I don't usually pre-wash either. I think that's the one thing that we are the same on. But I did have an instructor tell me recently that she doesn't pre-wash unless she thinks she has to. So if she's using a darker color like a red or a really deep purple or something, she'll just cut a tiny little swatch of the fabric and just place it in warm water and just sort of see what happens. So if it starts to bleed a little bit, then definitely pre-wash to take care of that. But if not, then you're probably fine.
Okay, I want to share something.
Yes.
And Ashley, you've seen this book. This is from my book all about strips. This quilt here it is obviously full of color.
Yes.
And I did not pre-wash it. Well, I'll tell you what, probably about a month ago, I washed it. It's just been sitting in a stack. I haven't used it or anything. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to bite the bullet and throw that in the washer and see what happens. I was scared. I really was. It's all Moda solids, Moda Bella solids that I used in that quilt. I didn't have any problems. I didn't use
Perfect.
any color catchers. I didn't do anything but just wash as I normally wash, and it came out perfect. So I mean, that's really a true test. And then also the Lexington sampler that we did for the last challenge, the National Quilter Circle Challenge. I did wash that and no problems, and it was reds and creams. So I have never had a problem with quilt shop quality fabrics bleeding.
Perfect. And I think we've all, I mean, you already said we can be a little impatient, and both you and I just like to get straight to the piecing.
Yeah.
All right. Someone asked, I have good tension. My scant 1/4 inch is good, but sometimes when I press my material open, I see the stitches. Not all the time, just once in a while. What could I be doing wrong?
What I would do is, if you do see them, just go ahead and tighten up that stitch length. Make your stitch length shorter, and you probably will resolve that issue.
I would say, and the other thing is anytime I start having any kind of stitch quality issues, it means you need to change your needle. That's like the number one thing to fix.
Yeah.
And I'm terrible about,
and also,
I wait until that happens and then I change my needle.
And then also think about, you know, has it been a while since you've serviced your sewing machine? Because it could be that you have a lot of lint within your sewing machine in places where it could be hindering that as well.
Yeah,
keep that
absolutely. I think a lot of times it's a simpler fix than we think it's going to be. We're afraid that it's, you know, a big tension problem or something, but it could just be a simple fix like that. So cleaning your machine and definitely changing the needle. All right, our next one here, Kathy says, when pressing my squares, how can I prevent them from being distorted?
Well, you want to do just that, is press them instead of iron. Iron is the act of going back and forth. And then the other thing is I use a dry iron. I don't use steam. I think, Ashley, you use steam. Yeah, I do not. However, sometimes I use pressing sprays. And when I use those, again, I just press. That's what I do, is I press. I might initially press, and maybe if I still have somewhat of a wrinkle showing, maybe I'll just kind of move the I'll take my mouse. I'll just move the iron sort of back and forth like this a little bit, and then lift it up and put it in the next spot. But the act of press or ironing is what distorts your fabric.
Yes, absolutely. And yes, I use steam. I have my iron sitting right here. This is one of those Aliso irons, and it's got the different steam, you know, no steam, and then 3 different steam options, and mine is always on just the most amount of steam possible. It's just, I don't know. I like it. It makes it lay flatter, I think.
Yeah, to each his own.
Yeah. Do you set your seam before you?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Can you explain what that is?
So what setting the seam is let's say you just sewed 2 pieces together, and you sewed it along this this edge here. What you want to do is take your iron and just press that seam down before you open that up, and then press it away from or towards you. So that's how you do that. But setting the seam, actually, what that does is just think about, you know, those loops that you're making with your sewing machine. It just sort of tamps those down and just sort of flattens that whole stitching line that you just did.
Absolutely. I think it makes it even easier to then fold it up over and press it.
It does. Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely. All right, just want to remind anybody, if they're just now joining, we're about halfway through, but if you have questions, I know the screen looks a little bit different this time, but we have a little chat section now, so you can just enter your question into the little chat bar, and it'll show up for us, and we can work our way through some more questions. So we have another question here. This is from Nancy. And she wants to know if we're having a new challenge. And the answer is possibly. I'm not sure I'm allowed to actually answer that yet. There's one coming soon, and that's really all I can say. So you're going to have to just look at the Facebook group page. If you're not a part of that, it's the NQC Quilt Block Challenge Facebook group page, or the National Quilter Circle Facebook group page, my page, Instagram. As soon as we can tease it out a bit, we will. So just stay tuned for that one. Our next one here, Marty asked, how do you determine what color of thread to use when you can't get the exact shade you need?
Well, depending on what you're working with, a lot of times a light gray works on almost anything. I mean, of course, if your fabrics are a little bit darker, I wouldn't go. But for instance, well, let me give you another example. If you would be sewing, say, Civil War reproduction fabrics, of course, those have sort of a duskier look to them. And a lot of times I'll notice that the overall color has sort of a goldish tint to it. So a lot of times I'll use a gold thread, sort of like for a better word, a dirty gold, to sew those pieces together. And it typically, I don't have any issues whatsoever. So kind of look at the overall color of your fabrics and see if you can pull out a color. But I would say for the most part, like your medium to light colored fabrics that you're sewing together, and maybe if there's a dark here and there, if you go with a gray, that's a better way to go than say like a white or an off-white.
And so that's, you do that when you're piecing or when you're quilting, or both?
I do that when I'm piecing. Quilting, when it comes to quilting, again, this audience may not know, but I don't do a lot of quilting myself. So I typically just leave that up to the expert, who is the quilter. And I ask their recommendation. I myself like things to sort of disappear. I don't like, personally, it's just a personal preference, I don't like, say, like a red thread on a red and cream quilt. That kind of bothers me. I want something that's going to sort of blend. Still give you that beautiful quilting look, but where it will blend in. So that's personal preference, really.
I have to think. I've never matched my thread to my fabric when I've been piecing. I don't know if you guys can see. I like thread, but I like it as decoration mostly. It's pretty on my walls behind me. So I honestly just pick whatever thread I have, and I guess I've never done that when I've matched it for piecing. So I'm gonna have to do that next time and see if it makes a difference and see how it looks on there.
Yeah, typically that's what you want to do, is try and get as close as you can color. And if it's not spot on, don't worry about that either. Maybe if it's, let's say that maybe you're piecing together a bunch of sort of green hued fabrics, just get the right green, whether it's a yellow green or a blue green. Just kind of sort of determine that. Because I've been in situations there where all I have on hand is maybe a blue green, but I really need a green. So in that case, I would probably just go with a light gray.
Perfect. I think I just have a fear of never having the right color of thread, which is why I just have to have so much.
And it's fun.
And next one here, Deborah asks, what brand of iron do you recommend, or what do you use?
Oh gosh, I think right now I have a Shark.
Like the little one? Is it, or no, does that mean it's?
No, it's just the brand is Shark. I actually got it at Kohl's. I got Kohl's. The one that I had before that, I had a Rowenta at one time, and that was good for a while. But quite frankly, I just tried to find one that was really good, and I did a lot of research online. And I wanted something that I didn't have to order. I needed it like that afternoon. So, excuse me, I sat and just sort of Googled recommendations, and I ended up with that one. And I did have it. I'll be honest. After the first year, I had issues, but Kohl's took it back, and I got another one, and I've had it ever since.
Perfect. I was going to show mine again because I am a huge fan of mine. This is the Oliso one, and it's one of those that has that auto lift. So like when you touch it, it's got these things here. So like when you touch it, these retract, and then you press, and then as soon as you let go, it pops back up. And so that's super handy. It's also a little dangerous because when I was at the National Quilter Circle headquarters, they don't have one. And you got used to just letting go of the iron. And that one did not just pop back up. So if you use this kind of iron, make sure that when you aren't using that one, you remember to pick it back up so you don't burn your fabric. All right, our next one here, I might need some clarification. This is from Michelle, and she says the binding goes on the inside of the quilt, correct?
I'm wondering if what she means is, let's see. So you mean this as being the inside of the quilt, and you would attach your binding across the top? Maybe that's what she means.
Oh, maybe. Okay. So yeah, so you would
attach it this way, sew it on, and then you flip it to the front.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So which goes towards the center of your quilt. So maybe that's what she was. I'm going to assume that's what she meant.
I didn't even put that together, so that's perfect. So if that's not what you meant, Michelle, please send us a follow-up, but that sends me gives me another question for you. So you said you flip it to the front.
Yes.
So
I'm sorry. I'm glad you caught me there.
Okay.
So I mean, there are different ways of doing it.
Yeah.
Actually, if you're going to hand sew it you want to flip it to the back. You want to sew it to the front and flip it over to the back and hand sew it. If you are sewing it by machine, sew it to the back, flip it over to the front, and there's a way to sew it like just a thread or two in from the edge. You want to use your machine to sew that on. And if you end up attaching your, I would do that all the time when I was I used to have my quilts in magazines all the time. So I was constantly cranking out my quilt designs. So what I would do is I would sew, I would do all of my binding by machine instead of by hand. And when you flip that over and you sew it to the front, just be careful not to sew too far to the, I guess when you're sewing it in, too far to the right. You don't want to sew too far to the right, because I like to call that, it kind of gives sort of like a pie look, like you have too much. Yeah, it just starts getting a little wavy. So just take it slow. I'm all about slow sewing. Just take it slow and just barely sew along that edge, and it really looks beautiful.
Absolutely. And then if you are someone who wants to hand sew it on as opposed to do the machine sewing, we have a video where one of our instructors demonstrates the invisible stitch, is what she calls it, for attaching your binding, which is probably the way that I always do it too. But another just random tip is to just find somebody who likes to put bindings on and have them do that for you. I just found out that my mom likes to hand sew bindings. She might find some quilts in the mail to her soon that she can put some bindings on.
That's awesome.
All right, our next one here, this is from Nina. Does your bobbin thread always have to be the same way as the top thread, or can one use bobbin thread like in embroidery?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You can do that. I've used bobbin and top thread embroidery, and again, I use RFL. It's always worked for me, and I actually did some quilts that I helped David Butler write his book, and when I made all the quilts for his book, there were a couple that we did, or that he wanted to have sort of an embroidery thread look on the top. And that's what I did. I used it in the bobbin and in the top thread. You were asking, can you have two different weights? And you certainly can.
Do you ever find that you have any kind of tension issues when you do that? Because I guess I've always tried to keep them the same.
But every machine is different. And for the most part, you probably do have to adjust it. My machine, I've never had an issue with it.
Okay.
So if you do have any problems where maybe it's nesting as you're sewing, then you do want to adjust your thread, your tension thread.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here, this is from Julie. She says that she's missed some of your live feeds, so she's not sure if anyone has asked, but she's learning to free motion on her Pfaff machine. I'm in conflict with needles and thread. Is there a basic rule of thumb, or what is the best needle and thread for free motion quilting?
Well, you really can use almost anything in free motion quilting as far as thread is concerned. I would recommend that when you purchase your needles for your sewing machine, there are needles that say for quilting. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know the weights or the numbers of them, or the number, I guess I should say. But you can look that up online and get instruction that way. Or wherever you're purchasing them, just let them know what you're doing, and they'll direct you to the proper needle to use.
Absolutely. I don't know if this is a basic tip that can be used across the board, or if it just happens to work sometimes when I need it to, but with free motion quilting, you're obviously going in different directions as opposed to just front and back with regular sewing. And so I found that if you use an embroidery needle or a top stitch needle or some kind of needle that has a slightly bigger eye, I don't have as many stitch quality issues. And I think it's just because the thread moves more freely through there and it's not, I guess, pulled on as tightly. So again, I don't know if that always works, but if you just happen to have one of those needles lying around, try that out and see if that sort of fixes your issue. Perfect. All right, Julie says, free motion quilting question. Just learning on my home machine and need your input on thread and needles. Does the machine dictate each of these, or is there a set rule?
I'm thinking that that's kind of similar to the last question.
Yeah.
I would really strongly suggest, because if I had a minute, I were able to do it, I'd probably just look it up for you. I'd just Google it real quick. But I would highly recommend that you either stop by your local quilt shop and pick the phone up and call them and ask them, or do a search online, because there's so many resources on that sort of thing. Machines can be really picky with what needles you use and what task you're doing. And because you're sewing 3 layers together, you want to make sure. I think it is a ballpoint needle that is used for quilting, for machine quilting, just so, because you're doing so much movement, and it's just smoother to go into all the layers, to go in and come back out, instead of like a real sharp pointed needle. So I think that's what a quilting needle actually is. I'd have to look it up though. But my recommendation is definitely ask an expert.
Absolutely. I always recommend, if you don't have a local quilt shop or something like that, if you just go to Schmetz is the brand of needle that I usually use a lot, and their website is amazing. And they obviously know, everything about needles. So I would check them out. I would spell that for you if I could right now.
Yeah.
But Schmetz is the brand.
SCHMETZ, I believe it's spelled. Yeah.
Go with that. Perfect. All right. Susan says, hi, Susan from Long Beach, California. She's working on her first quilt ever. Pattern instructions state to square the blocks prior to sewing together. I learned how to do this from my instructor, but subsequent research turned up very little mention of what seems to be this crucial step, both in reference books and online. Why is this?
I really don't know. I can tell you this, because I ran a magazine. I ran McCall's Quilting, and I sewed a lot of quilts for McCall's. So I'm real familiar with the way that they wrote patterns, and I've picked up a lot of the way that they wrote patterns. And we just would never mention a square up size. But what I would recommend to you is, if you are looking for a square up size, let's say this is your block. Of course, this is rectangular, but let's pretend it's square. And it's supposed to be 12.5 by 12.5. When you look at a pattern, typically, it will tell you what your finished size of the block should be. Always add a 1/2 inch to that figure. Finished means how it will look in the quilt itself. If you don't know what the square up size should be, what I recommend you do is sort of look at the fabrics, the cut sizes of the fabrics that make up the block. Let's say you have 3 rows or a total of 9 patches that make up your block. And let's say each of those patches is, you start out with 3.5-inch pieces of fabric. Typically what you do is you take that whole number. So it would be 3, 6, 9. So that should be a 9.5-inch block when it's finished. It's kind of hard to answer over our chat. But I would say if anybody has any questions, you're more than welcome to email me at susguzdesigns.com in my comments section of my website. I'd be more than happy to help you with whatever pattern you have.
Absolutely. And I will just point out, since you said it is not mentioned in some and mentioned in others, and like you said, you guys never mentioned it necessarily when you guys were putting together patterns, but definitely even the pattern that I'm working on right now, it says, you know, has the instructions on whatever you're making, and then when you get to the end of that step, it says section should measure 5.5 or unit should equal 3.5, or it tells you what it should be, so then you can measure it, and obviously if it's not, then you need to correct it and either square it up, or if it's too small, you might have to remake that section. But so I know that is common. And then even in our 2 challenges ago, that designer, she made a lot of the blocks oversized specifically so that you did need to cut them down or square them up. So it could just be the difference in authors and their styles and that too. So kind of find what you like to do and stick with that. So if you're...
I would just make a comment across the board for the most part, whether, because I've designed for fabric companies as well, across the board for the most part, that's just never really mentioned. So you have to kind of figure that size out yourself at times. And again, what I would do is just kind of lay out all the patches in your block and just kind of, if you're able to put those patches into rows, even sketch out, maybe do a little sketch. You can tend to figure those out. The other thing is, whoever the designer is, if you're having any issues, I know that they, as well as myself, were more than welcome or more than happy to help you with those sizes. Just say, hey, I'm making XYZ quilt and block 3, what is the square up size for it?
Absolutely. Perfect. All right. Wendy asked, can you recommend a sewing machine for quilting? Also to be used for free motion?
Well, there are so many out there. I really, it's kind of hard for me because I don't know the latest and greatest of what's going on. I personally have a Juki. It's a quilt machine, and oh gosh, off the top of my head, I can't think of the name, the actual model number of it, but it is a quilting machine. Some people actually use it for quilting. It's a straight stitch only, and that's what I love about it. It's a workhorse. Again, go ahead and contact me, and I can let you know what that is if you're interested. But what I would recommend is there's so many people that are always constantly, you know, either buying a new machine or whatnot, and in chat rooms, you can always throw that question out there and get some really good feedback. But you'll get a lot.
Yeah.
How I ended up with my machine is I did research. Again, you know, I used Google, and I just looked at a lot of reviews. I wanted a workhorse. You know, write a list down of the different qualities that you're looking for in a machine that are important to you. You might like an alphabet, you know, to be able to stitch out your quote labels with. That might be something important for you. I do have another machine that does that. So when I make machine stitched quilt labels for my quilts, that's what I use. But otherwise, I just use my Juki, the straight stitch. And I love it.
Perfect. I have mine is sitting right here, but so you can get a machine that does all of that though, like has the alphabet, has decorative stitches, and is a quilting machine. So mine is a Brother, and it's the SQ9050. So it's the Sewing Quilting 9050. I don't even know if they make it anymore, but sometimes you just luck out and get the perfect machine for you. I bought this machine doing zero research. It was just the only one that was sold at Walmart in Fairbanks, Alaska when I was in college. And it has been the most amazing machine, and I still use it all the time. So sometimes you just luck out and you find the perfect one.
Yeah, I think actually we talked about this one other time. My first machine that I bought, I had one that was in storage, and it was in another state. So I bought one, actually, it was probably very similar to the one that you have, and it was a brother. And I loved it. I ended up buying a second one because I was making so many quilts. Monthly, I was making quilts, and I just sewed the heck out of that. And I'm surprised it wasn't smoking at the end. I ended up buying a second one. Um, After a while, though, I wanted one that shifted so much with all the quilting I did and the big, the big quilts that you're sewing together. And because of all that shifting, that was really becoming bothersome. So that's when I looked into something that was a lot sturdier that wasn't going to move around a whole lot. And that's when I ended up with my Juki, which is a really good price point too. It was, I think it was like $8.99 for that machine. So it was a really great price point. Just doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles to it.
Perfect. I bought mine on a poor college kid budget, so mine was much less, but still, love it.
Oh,
Another thing, definitely try out your machine. So go to a quilt shop, sit down, and actually try out the machine, so that way you know, like you mentioned, if it moves around or something, if that's going to bother you, you can know right off the bat if that's going to be an issue. All right, our next one here is from Jackie, and she says, if you're making a quilt with a pattern like in a bear paw block, and you want the paw or the claws to be the focus, what would you do?
As far as fabric is concerned, and you want the paw or the claws as the focus. Well, I would either make that prominent with a darker color, or the opposite. Have your background the dark color and have the paw and the claws a lighter. So I would just go to extreme with one or the other, and that will definitely make that pop.
Would you also do, say, if you had multiple, so a bear paw block has all these little points around the outside edge, right? That looks like the claw. So I guess if you had a quilt that had a bunch of those on there, would you maybe change up so that maybe one was dark with a light background or light and dark background, or would you try to keep it sort of all the same scheme, sort of?
Well, it's really personal preference, and it's whether it goes back to an earlier question, whether you're using solids or whether you're using prints. I love scrappy quilts, and see, that's like my specialty. And I have a special way that I color quilts, which I do talk about in my book. Um, and anyway, just in the first section, I sort of talk about how I color quilts. But there's a way to do it in placing your dominant fabrics across the whole face of your quilt. And then as far as what fabrics you choose to put in each block, so there would probably most likely be two fabrics, your paw and claws, and then the background. It's really up to you. It's all in the planning process, and how you're going to do that. And there's so many variables, I guess is what I should say.
So speaking of just planning things out, and you said you like scrappy quilts. So obviously there's a quilt behind you. And if I was making something like that, I would just go totally random and put it together. But did you actually plan out, like you mentioned, if you had to quickly explain how you would do that?
Okay, well, how I color quilts is it's all part of the design process as well. Because if I want to write a good tight pattern, something that's going to be easily followed and not too many, let's say that there's 25 SKUs, 25 different prints in the quilt behind me. You want to be able to place those fabrics in a way within your quilt where it's giving you balance. So that's one thing that you have to keep in mind. All the quilts that I design, I do using the electric quilt software. So I can visually see where I'm placing everything. I know not everybody has that. So another way to do that, to balance out and to to place your fabrics in areas where you do have balance. For instance, you have a blue. You want to place your blue around your quilt where it's going to be sort of spread out and not sort of lumped in a corner or all in a row somewhere within your quilt. You want to sort of scatter that all over the place. But the best way that I do it is using the software. If you don't have the software, just make your blocks, lay them out in a space, and then just move your blocks around until it looks right to you.
Just a follow-up to that one, because you mentioned a quilt can have 25 different colors. Is there, in your opinion, because I know you like color more than I do sometimes, can you have too many different prints or too many different colors? Is there sort of a cap of you should only don't go over this many number of different fabrics in a quilt?
I don't think that's the case. I think it's really more you need to have a balance with the intensity of the colors. Like you want to have say a certain amount of medium, light, and dark fabrics. You can eliminate one of those and it can still work. But you also have to take into consideration the different prints, the different size of prints. So it's really, I wish I could do a class on it right now, but we don't have time.
Well, we have about 8 minutes left. So if you can do like an 8-minute class, they can squeeze this in. No, not that. Okay.
I don't have any props or anything, unfortunately, or else I'd love to do it.
It would just all be hand motions. But speaking of that, so we have, like I said, about 8 more minutes. So if anyone has any more questions, definitely put those into the chat section, and we'll work our way through answering a few more. One here from Stacy. She says that when she's pressing a block, she feels like it's shrinking. Is this possible?
Shrinking? Huh. I don't think so. Shouldn't be shrinking. I guess I don't really. The only thing that comes to mind is if you're thinking, okay, my block is supposed to, excuse me, finish at 12 and a half by 12 and a half. And it's not. Check your seams, whether you're pressing them completely. You might want to use a pressing spray and just press. You use your fingers a lot to press those seams open, like away from you if you're pressing away. Help that iron the pressing process by using your fingers to sort of press those out. So that's one thing. Check your seams. Make sure you are sewing 1/4-inch seams, or in some cases, scant 1/4-inch seams when you have blocks that have a lot of points, like we were talking earlier with a pinwheel block that has a lot of points coming together. And when you go to open those up, you sometimes lose those points because they're sort of, with all the bulk of the fabric at the back, the point gets lost in sort of the valley in between where you sew them together. So there's a few different things that you can check.
So when I was thinking that the fabric was physically shrinking because of the heat of the iron. So is that even possible if you're, say, not using, as you've mentioned, a quilt shop quality fabric? Can the heat of an iron shrink fabric?
I'm not aware of it. Yeah,
no?
I'm just not aware of it. Yeah, I wish I could ask her a couple more questions, whether, but check those things, check those few items about definitely pressing, because that could be an issue, that you're not completely pressing things open.
And you mentioned, right, a pressing spray. I've never actually used one before. What is it? And I guess how does it help?
Pressing spray just helps you to press. It's water.
It's not water. Like what is
water based? You can use water, but a pressing spray versus a spray starch, there's differences in the ingredients as to what they are, but they essentially do the same thing.
So is that, I've seen Best Press at the store, something like that?
Yeah, Best Press is a pressing spray.
Okay. Do you know, I don't know if I'm throwing too many questions, what is the difference between a pressing spray and a starch? Do you know?
Well, like I said, it's ingredients.
Okay.
You can do a quick Google search to see what the ingredients are. One of them is made like with a cornstarch, I believe. So like a food-based type ingredients list. And a lot of people like to stay away from those because of bug issues. But quite frankly, if you don't pre-wash your fabrics and you wash your quilts after you're finished, you shouldn't have an issue with that.
So, but should you definitely wash that stuff out? I guess what is the bug issue?
Well, I mean, in areas of the country where bugs are prevalent, like in Colorado, we don't have that issue so much. But in certain areas of the country, and especially if you live in an older home, I mean, you could have bug issues. You know, you could have bugs that come in, ants, whatever. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of people typically know that, understand that about the differences in pressing sprays. But if you don't, go ahead and look it up, and you can just a quick Google search will educate you.
Absolutely. I'm gonna have to do that Google search. Just I know we've talked about this briefly in the past, just because we're talking a little bit about starch and how this sort of I wouldn't say a new thing, but when people are preparing their fabric for quilting, they're pre-washing and also folding and starching. What is your thoughts on that, and do you do it? I know the answer.
Oh, yeah, you do know the answer. I do not pre-wash, and I press my fabrics before I cut them. I press them, and if I'm working with, let's say that a pattern calls for 3 yards of something. So you're going to be probably using quite a bit of that if it's called for your quilt top. I just do it in sections. I just as I'm cutting, let's say my first instruction is to cut, I think I used this example earlier, say like 10 2.5-inch wide strips with the fabric. I would just take a section of fabric and press that first, do my cuts, and then go back to the ironing board and press whatever else I need from there. I just do it in small sections.
Perfect. All right, we have time for one last question here. They say, hi guys, as a beginner to quilting, do you recommend a certain design or type of quilt that would be easiest to understand?
Well, there's quite a bit of different ones out there. There are so many different quilt patterns on the market. Everybody has their different style of writing patterns. I would say the best thing to do is on your own, start by just sewing patches together, same size patches together. Take a charm square stack and just sew those together. Kind of lay them out because they're 5-inch by 5.5 or 5-inch. 5.5 by 5.5, right?
I thought they were 5 inches. So the minis are 2.5, then there's 5, and then there's 10. I think.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay.
So just lay those 5-inch patches out in an open area, and just move those around a little bit, and then just start sewing those into rows. Once you have all those rows sewed together, you want to press each row in opposite directions, because then when you go to sew those rows together, they're going to nicely nestle together because your seam allowances are going in opposite directions. So go ahead and then sew each row to the unit until you're finished, and you have a really simple, easy quilt top. And that's a really great way to start.
Absolutely. Perfect. All right, so that was about all we have time for. That wraps up with our last question. I want to thank everybody for asking questions, and for you for answering all of our questions. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and I hope they tune in next month where we'll answer even more questions. And also about the upcoming challenge, just stay tuned and we will announce when that will be happening. So we'll have some fun information on that. So thank you everybody again for being here, and thank you, Susan.
Thank you, and thank you, audience. So glad to have you.
Absolutely. All right, I hope everyone has a good night.